Chapter 10 Valley of Despair. Early the next morning, Jamin awakened his two companions. The three soldiers stood together at the mouth of the cave while Jamin sounded the morning trumpet call, asking the king for guidance in the day ahead. After a hasty breakfast, they left the cave and, descending to the forest, continued south along the mountain ridge. As they went, Lannis noticed that the forest became thicker and gloomier, with high trees meeting far overhead to shut out the sunlight. The danger of attack was much greater here in the shadows, and the three soldiers carried their swords in their hands and their shields slung ready for use. All that day they traveled with hardly a pause, and that night they camped in the woods on a small knoll where, under Jamin's direction, they piled rocks into a defensive wall around them. Each of the three took turns watching while the other two slept, for they were getting deep into the enemy territory. Lannis had the middle watch, and when Jamin shook him awake, the night was cold and dark. After Jamin had gone to sleep, wrapped in his traveling cloak, and with the heat-giving sword lying on his breast, Lannis sat cross-legged, staring out into the darkness. The light from his sword shone on the tree trunks around and down the dark avenues between the trees. Lannis was glad that this light was of such a nature that the evil ones could not see it, for its glow would have invited attack. Twice in the distance as the night wore on, Lannis heard the high-pitched wind wail, which told that the enemy was abroad in strength, and once the sword light flared up strongly, indicating that some of the evil ones were nearby. But if they knew of the presence of the little band, they gave no sign. Finally the moon peeped briefly through the clouds, and Lannis saw by its position that it was time to call Robin to take over the watch. Soon afterwards Lannis was sound asleep, to awaken in the grey dawn only when Robin shook him. "Today," said Jamin, as they were eating breakfast, "we will reach the castle." "And what do we do then?" asked Lannis. Jamin only smiled. "Let's take one thing at a time," he said. "Our first problems are the miles which lie between us and the castle." They set out again, moving southward and even deeper into the forest. The sky, gray in the morning, grew darker as they advanced, and wisps of fog began to drift across their path. "Perhaps it will storm," said Robin. "No," said Jamin over his shoulder. "Near the Castle of Despair it is always dark. Stay close and keep your weapons ready." After several more hours of steady travel, during which it grew still darker, Jamin suddenly halted. Motioning for silence, he pointed ahead to where a deep gorge cut across the mountain ridge. Then he led the way cautiously forward to the edge of the gorge and, parting the underbrush carefully with his hands, pointed downward. Lannis caught his breath. From their feet the ground fell away in a precipice to a narrow valley far below, and rising from the bottom of the gorge, partially shrouded in an oppressive black fog, were the towers of a great stone castle. This, Lannis realized, was the Castle of Despair. The castle was black, like the fog, and appeared cold and brooding and sinister, like some evil beast that crouched in the valley waiting to spring upon its victim. There were no lights nor signs of life. Around the castle was a still, black lake, reaching nearly from side to side of the narrow valley. A stone causeway led across this lake to the castle gates. Jamin turned and led the way back several hundred yards to where a large boulder thrust itself out of the ridge. Here the three seated themselves on the ground. "We will eat now, for we will need all our strength for what lies ahead," said Jamin in guarded tones. As they ate, Jamin explained his plan. "The main castle gate," he said, "is well guarded. However, there is a small side door to the Castle of Despair, which few know about. It is reached by crossing the causeway, then skirting the outside of the wall. Usually there is only a single guard on this door. If we overpower him, we can get into the castle. Once inside, I know the way through the back passages to the dungeon where Waver must be. We must release him and give him his sword and shield, which we brought for him. Then we must fight our way out." Lannis, who had been listening intently, looked up with a puzzled frown. "But you haven't told us how you plan to unlock the door of the castle, or how you will open the dungeon door to get Waver out." Jamin smiled. Did I not tell you that you would learn more about the wonders of the sword of the Spirit before this mission is accomplished? Draw your swords. Do you see the 5 grooves that run the length of the blade? Both lads nodded, and Robin said, I've often wondered what they were. The sword, said Jammin, is the master key to all the locks in the castle of the enemy. It was so designed by our Lord and King, who knew all there is to know about locks long before the great evil one built the first of his castles. The enemy cannot make a lock that this key will not open, and that is one of his greatest weaknesses. Jammin continued, but there is another serious problem in our path, and I think from his expression Robin was going to ask about it. Robin nodded. I was wondering how we are going to get across the causeway without the alarm being raised. That will be difficult, said Jammin, but I have thought of a way. You have noticed the black fog which hangs around the castle. It is an evil fog which is called the blackness of darkness, or the blackness of despair, and was created by the great evil one himself as a defense for the castle. It is a poisonous vapor which robs those who breathe it of their strength. But having created it, the enemy cannot entirely control it, and the Book of the King tells us that the evil one himself will be overcome by it at last. It has this advantage for us. The evil one, whose eyes can penetrate ordinary darkness, cannot clearly see through this fog. Therefore, we may be able to use the blackness of darkness to conceal us. If we wait on the valley slopes until the fog eddies across the causeway, hiding it from the view of the guards on the gate, we can cross without being seen. There is a principle there, continued Jammin, to which soldiers of the king might well take heed. The enemy's greatest strength is often his weakness, and the very excess of evil may provide the avenue through which salvation comes. But if we breathe the fog, will we not lose our strength? Asked Robin. Again Jammin's face broke into a smile, and his eyes twinkled. Your swords again, gentlemen, he said. Your wonderful swords. Hold the flat of the blade a few inches in front of your noses and mouths, and any air you take in will be purified and sweetened. He stood up, as if to go, and Lannis, who had been listening silently, said, Tell us, Jammin, how is it that you know so much about the castle and the habits of the enemy? Jammin, his face once again serious, replied, It's because once, many years ago, I too was a captive of the enemy, and was held in a dungeon of this very castle, but that is a long story that I must tell you another time. From his breast he drew forth the silver trumpet. Then, noting the look of surprise on Lannis's face, he smiled. It is perfectly safe, Lannis, he said. Have you forgotten that the ears of the evil ones are deaf to the notes of the trumpet, just as their eyes are blind to the sword light? But this call will be heard by our Lord and King, whom we trust for strength and guidance. Raising the trumpet to his lips, Jammin blew a beautiful, clear note which echoed across the mountains. Then, turning to the other two, he continued, Never neglect the silver trumpet, lads. Use it often while on the king's business, and if ever all seems lost, sound an urgent call for help upon it, for so has many a despairing soldier been saved. And now we must go. He drew his sword, Robin and Lannis crossing theirs upon it, and the 3 comrades stood silent for a moment, while the glow from the crossed swords lit up the gloom around them, and the warmth of fellowship penetrated their bodies. Then Jammin turned and led the way toward the Valley of Despair. The 3 moved quietly along the edge of the precipice until they came to a small ravine thickly grown with underbrush, which led steeply down into the main gorge. Down this ravine they crept until they reached a point only a few feet from the valley floor. Here, hidden by the underbrush, they crouched, watching the slow eddying movement of the deadly fog which hung in strips like tattered curtains along the castle walls. For hours they waited. The gloom of the valley was so intense that they had no idea whether it was noon or evening. From inside the castle they heard an occasional low and far-off cry, like a creature in agony, but except for that, the whole valley seemed long dead and deserted. Finally, a patch of fog drifted in front of the castle gate, then another. The 2 together grew in size slowly, steadily, until nearly the whole causeway was swathed in blackness. Jammin rose silently. The time had come. With drawn sword he led the way out of the ravine and along the edge of the lake to the causeway. Then, in close single file, each with his hand on the shoulder of the one ahead, the three moved slowly out on the black stones. As they entered the fog, they held their swords vertically in front of their mouths and found, as Jammin had predicted, that the air they breathed remained clear and sweet. The causeway was wide enough for two to have walked abreast, but the stones were black and slippery, and even with the help of the light cast by the sword, it was difficult to determine where the edge was, for the sword light penetrated the fog only a short distance. Cautiously, step by step, the three moved forward. After what seemed like an hour, though it was only a few minutes, Jammin stopped. Lannis, looking past him, saw just ahead the iron-bound gates of the castle stretching upward into the fog. Jammin turned sharply to the left and led the way along a narrow ledge at the base of the castle wall. After a short distance, the ledge broadened and Jammin slowed his pace. Then suddenly they broke out of the fog. There, not 10 feet away, was a small archway in the castle wall, and standing at its entrance, with sword drawn and teeth bared in a snarl, was one of the evil ones. He had evidently heard their footsteps, for he was bending forward, peering intently into the fog. When he saw them, he straightened up and opened his mouth to shout. At the same instant, Jammin leaped forward like a tiger unleashed, and with a tremendous slashing blow from his sword, silenced him before he could utter a sound. As the guard's body slumped to the ground, Jammin turned quickly and whispered, "Robin, stay here and guard the entrance. Keep it clear at all costs, for it is the only way we can get out again. Lannis, unlock the door." While Jammin wiped the blade of his sword, Lannis stepped into the archway, where he found his way blocked by a heavy stone door. Carefully, he fitted the blade of his sword into the keyhole, pushed until the entire blade had disappeared inside, then twisted gently. There was a click, and the door swung easily open. Jammin, who had come up behind Lannis, went in first with his blade ready. Lannis pulled his sword free and followed. They found themselves in a dark, stone-floored corridor. Jammin led the way confidently through a maze of turns and twists and down several flights of steps until they reached a level where the floors were damp and slippery, and water dripped continuously from the walls. Finally, he stopped in front of a large iron door. "Keep watch," he whispered to Lannis. He bent and slid his sword into the keyhole. A moment later, with a loud creaking sound, the door swung back. Jammin, holding his sword high, slipped inside, leaving Lannis alone in the corridor. A moment later, Jammin emerged again, his face shining with joy. Leaning on his arm, weak and pale, but smiling, was Waver.